Thank you very much, Art, and thanks so much, Lucero, also for co-hosting this talk. It's a real honor to be with you.
George, thank you so much. We're going to start off with our first question that Lucero has.
You know, after reading your article and exploring some of your work, I've noticed that you describe capitalism as the reason that's destroying our planet. Could you discuss why we also need to address other ideologies such as consumerism or neoliberalism and the effects that they have on our planet as well as our mental health?
Thank you. That is a question which we could fill the entire discussion with. But let me, and you'll find that I talk far too much. I completely disregard Mark Twain's advice that if God had meant us to talk more than we listen, he would have given us one ear and two mouths. But I will try to keep it tight. And so let's first of all look quickly at what capitalism is. And it's a question which remarkably is very seldom asked. And whenever anybody says, well, capitalism is the best system ever, you say, so, okay, so what's capitalism? And then you suddenly find this sort of confident assertion turning into, oh, and people really struggle to define it. The best definition I've come up with, unfortunately, is totally incomprehensible, which is that capitalism creates and ruptures. Capitalism is an economic system which creates and ruptures its own hypervolume. But unless you've got a PhD in ecology, that isn't going to mean anything to anyone. But it's sort of neat and tight. And look up hypervolume. Look up the Hutchinsonian hypervolume, and I think that takes us to where, in sort of human terms, capitalism is. But the most interesting explanation of capitalism I've come across is the work by Jason Moore on the island of Madeira in the Atlantic, which was discovered by the Portuguese in 1420. In fact, it was uninhabited at the time. And it was called Madeira because it was covered in madeira, in wood, trees, which were very scarce in Portugal at the time, which was a big problem for the Portuguese because they relied on trees for their navy. And they thought, whoa, but bonanza, and they just started, taking the wood and tilling some of the soil, putting their animals on, the same as they'd done before. And then someone realized, a couple of decades in, that actually we don't have to do things here the way we've done them before. We can do things in a completely different way because there's no prior relationships attached to this land. And there's no rules, there's no framework, there's no structure which says you have to follow particular social codes. You have to do it in a pre-existing fashion. And so they said, well, here we've got this opportunity just to make a load of money in whichever way we wish. And the most lucrative product which could be produced in a place like Madeira at the time was sugar. And they brought in slaves, first of all, from the Canaries and then from Africa. They brought in money from Flanders and from Genoa. And they cleared the land on this island, which had, as far as the Portuguese were concerned, no prior social relations. And in doing so, they created the three preconditions which Karl Polanyi establishes for capitalism, which are the commodification of land, labor, and money. And what happened was that within a very short period of time, Madeira became the world's biggest producer of sugar, even though it's just a small island. And it rapidly overtook everywhere else and peaked in sugar production in 1506, where it was turning out a phenomenal amount of sugar from a relatively small space. But within 20 years, that whole economy had crashed. By 1526, it was producing just 20% of the sugar that it was producing in 1506. And the reason for this was that the productivity of slave labor had collapsed. And the reason it had collapsed is that they had used all the easily available sources of madeira, of wood. You need, 60 kilograms of wood, or you did 60 kilograms of wood to produce 1 kilogram of sugar, because you required the wood to process and refine the sugar cane. And as they exhausted the easily accessible wood, the slaves had to go further and further to find the same amount of wood, and they had to go up the steep mountains and more and more difficult sources. And so it collapsed, the economy collapsed alongside much of the ecology. We know that at least 3 endemic species became extinct at the same time, probably a load more, but because they were snails, you can see the snail shells, so you knew what was there. There are probably a whole load of species which aren't in the paleontological record, so it's always affected by taphonomic bias. And then what did the Portuguese do? They just abandoned it. And they went on to San Tomé, another group of Atlantic islands which they'd recently stumbled across. And they did exactly the same there. And then they moved on to Brazil, to the coastal lands of Brazil, and they did exactly the same there, quickly exhausted those lands. They moved on to the Caribbean, and they did the same there. And what we see happening there was not just the invention of a system which contains those 3 preconditions of Karl Polanyi's, but we also see a system that from its inception was about boom, bust, and quit. Boom, bust, quit, boom, bust, quit. And that is what capitalism has done ever since. Capitalism is a fire front that burns through resources, whether those are ecological resources, human resources, intellectual resources, whatever it is, it's always seeking new frontiers. It burns up the frontier and then goes off and finds a new one. We can still see this fire front in a very physical sense, still spreading across the last places which haven't been torched by it, in South America, in West Papua, where Art and I met, which I would actually say I'd like to just modify what Art said, in that I don't see it as part of Indonesia. It's an occupied territory, which was where a totally fraudulent process was undertaken to try to justify the occupation. But anyway, we see it in West Africa as well, that fire front, but we also see it in other subtler ways, just burning across the world, just using up everyone and everything it comes across. And now the uber capitalists, people like Bezos and Musk, they're saying, right, okay, we can dispose of this planet altogether. Let's move on to some other planets, having burnt our way through this one. That is what capitalism is. It is a boom, bust, quit economy based on the commodification of land, labor, and money. But obviously the commodification has now gone a lot further than that into just about everything that it ever encounters. And the things we call consumerism and neoliberalism are particular varieties of capitalism. They're extremes of capitalism. And capitalism relies for its survival upon growth, perpetual growth. And growth depends on consumerism, which means people whose needs have already been met, being persuaded to part with their money to buy stuff they don't need. That's what consumerism is. And so capitalism has constantly to invent ever more ridiculous things and persuade us that we need those things, we want those things, and we must buy those things, because if it fails to do so, then it collapses. Of course, it's not the only way in which it expands. It captures public resources, it captures common resources, it just grabs everything it can get hold of. It is insatiable. That's the key issue with capitalism. And then neoliberalism, which is related obviously to consumerism in some ways, but it is unique in others. A very neat definition of that was proposed by William Davis at Goldsmiths University, which is that a neoliberalism is the disenchantment of politics by economics. Because what it effectively says is we can dispense with democracy. Democracy is no longer required because the market, this magical thing, this magical space that capitalism has created, which again is completely ill-defined. When you say to people, what is a market? Again, they really start to stumble and stutter over that one. But this thing called the market can discern what the decisions of society should be. Through buying and selling, we make the valid decisions. And those decisions determine who the winners and who the losers are. And according to neoliberal theory, this is the theory put forward by people like Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises and Milton Friedman. According to this theory, it establishes a natural and righteous hierarchy of winners and losers. And you can tell who the winners are because they're the ones with the money, and you can tell who the losers are because they're the ones without the money, and the winners deserve to be the winners. They are the righteous winners, and the losers are the undeserving poor. And they, in its purest sense, neoliberalism says, right, we can dispense with every other kind of decision-making in society. We can sweep away politics. In fact, politics is an interference. And Peter Thiel is a classic exponent of this theory. Politics and democracy are an interference with the pure workings of the market, which determines who the right people are and who the wrong people are. And of course, the people who say this, they're always the right people. They're always the ones with the money, or the ones who are being backed by the money to say that stuff. So that, in a nutshell, is how I would describe capitalism, consumerism, and neoliberalism. I'm glad we started on a light note.
Yeah, thank you, George. I think you highlight the historical exploitation, and sometimes it's hard to see that modern day exploitation, which you mentioned with the uber rich, like Jeff Bezos. As a millennial myself, I notice my own generation idolizing those folks like Elon Musk or Bill Gates. Can you elaborate more on how they're ultimately stealing from future generations?
Yeah. So capitalism is a pyramid scheme. It's not just a fire front which burns across space, but it also burns across time. And its apparent health today is a function of borrowing from the future and borrowing at rates which cannot be repaid. And so this great sort of bonanza of consumption, which is never greater than when exercised by billionaires, is a one-off bonanza. It's a one-time feast, which is consuming the future prosperity of people such as yourself and those who are yet to come. We've got good metrics now for showing just how grotesque and unfair and unsustainable this is. So in order to prevent more than 1.5 degrees of global heating, centigrade, our average per capita greenhouse gas production per year should be less than 2 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The top 1%, the richest 1% on Earth, they produce an average of 70 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. The billionaires on average produce 8,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And this, they arrogate to themselves ecological space, environmental space that does not belong to them. And this is another classic feature of capitalism, a feature which was sort of locked into place by John Locke in his second treatise of government, where he says, he posits this thing called the labor theory of property, that if you mix your labor with the land, or mix your labor with anything else, any other form of natural wealth, that accrues to you, that then belongs to you as a result of mixing your labor. So you think, okay, so if I go out and dig a hole somewhere, that land now belongs to me. And yes and no, Locke would say. It will if you're the first person to turn up. And of course, what he meant was the first European to turn up, because he conceived the Americas, where he worked as the secretary to the Lords Protectors of the Carolinas. He conceived the Americas as a terra nullis, as a place without people, because of course the people who were there, well, they don't really count, do they? And so he sort of metaphorically swept them off the map. They don't exist. And so the first man, as he put it, to come along and to dig and to mix his labor with the land meant obviously the first colonists from Europe, or ideally from England, because that's what they were really talking about. And you sort of magically establish your ownership of this land by mixing your labor with it. There's no reason given in the second treatise why you should do it that way rather than pissing on it, for example, like animals do. That would be a more obvious way, you'd think. But somehow by mixing your labor with the land, that land is yours. And you say, okay, fine, right, I'll come and mix my labor with your land and give me mine. But no, bizarrely, not only by digging that first hole do you annul all prior land rights, you also annul all future land rights. No explanation of why, of how, of what the just principle which allows you to do that is, but there's this one-off, this one moment when you can do it, which is basically when the colonist first steps foot on someone else's country, on the land of in this case, of the indigenous people of the Americas. Colonists arrives and they've got that one-off opportunity to mix their labor with the land. You think, okay, so you must have done an awful lot of labor, you guys who got like a couple of 1,000 acres of land. No, it turns out that your labor doesn't have to be your labor. It can be the labor of the people who labor for you. And in those days, of course, the people laboring for you, this was not free labor, these were slaves. And so it's your slaves mixing their labor with the land, which entitles you to that land. And though people have gone to great lengths not to see this blindingly obvious fact, what John Locke's theory is all about is a charter for the rights of slave owners. That's what it is. And that is the fundamental justification of modern capitalism. That's where the justification comes from, because from this notion of labor granting you a right to natural wealth, we quickly go, particularly through the work of William Blackstone, whose legal interpretations became the basis of a great deal of US law. We see this transmuted into money granting you that right, because money in this case is a representation of labor. And so the more money you have, the greater your entitlement to natural wealth. The more land you can take, the more meat you can eat, the more bluefin tuna, the more trees you can cut down, the more atmospheric space you can occupy. And somehow we've come to see that that's just a natural right. If you've got a load of money, you're entitled to a load of natural wealth. The more money you've got, the more natural wealth you're entitled to. Wait a minute, how? Where did this come from? What is the just principle behind that? And the fact is, and this is the sort of fatal flaw, the fatal fact at the heart of the entire system under which we live, there is no just principle behind that. There is nothing which says, there is no natural right, there is no sensible discourse which says you can translate the amount of money in your bank account to the share of the world's natural wealth to which you are entitled. Doesn't exist. And yet that's the entire basis of our system.
On action. Now, you've achieved acceptance across the generations, and I do realize that is because you are who you are. But I'd like to ask, how have you done that?
Well, it's not universal, I'll put it that way. I mean, my feeling is, it's absolutely essential that we join forces. I mean, the intergenerational conflict is what is destroying us. It's what's ripping this planet apart. And it's a one-sided conflict. It's people of my generation and older who are basically grabbing the resources on which other people will depend. And there's a fundamental, this conflict is almost encapsulated even within the UN Charter of Human Rights, which says that we're all entitled to the free use of property, to the use of our property without people taking our property away from us. But it says nothing about how much property any person should have. And what we've seen is that, there's this tremendous inequality, not just within generations, but between generations as well. And we tell young people a story. We say, you can go out into the world, and if you're enterprising and if you're clever, you can do as well as me. And they go out into the world and they might be enterprising and they're clever, but they find out that I already own it all. They can't have it because I've got it. So they can't do as well in those materialistic terms. And it's a fundamental deception. And I think it's that deception which drives so much social dysfunction. There's a fascinating book by Pankaj Mishra called The Age of Anger, where he starts off by saying the white supremacist terrorists and the Islamist terrorists really are one and the same. They're misogynistic, they're anti-Semitic, They have the same supremacist idea that only people of their particular, in one case, skin color, in another case, variety of Islam are the only people who can be counted as valid, and everyone else must be wiped out. And they have this sort of genocidal tendency in both cases. And he says we've got a very, very similar thing going on here. But it's not just, there's not just a similarity between these two groups, but also between them and the 19th century Russian nihilists, described by Dostoevsky, by Turgenev, by Lermontov, several other prominent Russian writers of the 19th century, and Dostoevsky called them the surplus men, or the superfluous men. These were the people who had basically been promised the world. And they were told, we can do away with all the old social structures now. You know, the traditional societal structures have broken down, so anyone can be anything. Anyone can have anything. And they set out into the world with that promise, as Dostoevsky describes so clearly. So set out with that promise into the world and find that they couldn't, that it's not available to them, that the world is not open to them in the way that they were promised. And what capitalism does today is to make bigger and bigger promises about what we can expect in our lives. And those promises cannot possibly be fulfilled because it's a winner-take-all system. It is a system of winners and losers. They're not the virtuous and the vicious, as the neoliberals will have you. It's often exactly the other way around. But whatever it is, it's just a few people taking almost everything and other people having almost nothing. And so you get humiliation. And what Mishra argues is that humiliation is the driving force of terrorism. And we have a system which he argues, I think, very effectively. We have a system which is set up to create maximum humiliation. I mean, that's not its purpose, that's not its intended purpose, but that's what it does. And it creates whole generations, particularly of young men, who are frustrated, humiliated, and inclined to turn towards violence. And that's the sort of another aspect of the sort of fundamental intergenerational disparity, inequality, which drives dysfunction. And is another example of dysfunction. But of course, what we're talking about here is the dysfunction that, you know, young people just don't even have the means to survive because it's being taken from them. Yeah, in the immediate sense, in that rents are almost impossible to pay in many cities around the world now because older generations and richer people within those generations have mopped up all the property and can just sit there, put a toll booth in front of that property and say, you must pay me a private tax if you want to have a roof over your head. But also, of course, in the wider sense that we're looking at the snatching of the ecological space within which young people and future generations are supposed to survive.
Yeah, of course. And I just want to, point out that this recurring theme word is something that younger generations like myself and the organization that I volunteer for, we love this word. So throughout your October 2021 Guardian article, there was this recurring theme of disobedience and how, we need it for our own survival. Many times acts of disobedience can be seen as like a protest or a direct action, and they're usually led by marginalized individuals that are then criminalized by the government and by the media. We've seen that in Arizona with folks that have protested the expansion of the US and Mexico border that are then detained and then, taken to court and, just criminalized all over. How would you persuade someone to join the environmental movement who may be hesitant to join due to this, or that just doesn't agree with these types of civil disobediences? Yeah,
thank you. Another excellent question. So, I mean, disobedience is difficult. I mean, let's not pretend. There's loads and loads of attempts to ensure that we obey and to punish severely disobedience. But disobedience is the only thing which can secure our survival and the only thing which ever has. Because if we obey this system, this earth-consuming system, this fire front system, which burns through every resource it encounters, then we go like beasts to the slaughter. It's like we're forming an orderly queue at the slaughterhouse gate. And we can't afford to do that. And we can't afford to allow them to frighten us into submission, because what we are submitting to is far more frightening than the thing that they threaten us with. And, you know, I'm not saying this is an easy choice for anyone, because, you know, you put your head in the judicial noose by disobeying this terrifying system. And that is really frightening, especially if you are few in number. It's much less frightening if there's millions of you, because they can't lock up millions of us. And it becomes politically impossible to attack those millions. Well, you would hope so. I mean, Egypt, for example, and Belarus suggests that maybe it's not as impossible as it ought to be, but it certainly is an awful lot harder. I mean, you can't do it while pretending to be a democracy in any way, shape, or form. You have to just abandon that pretense altogether. And then once you've abandoned that pretense, then everybody is faced with that choice. Nobody can pretend there isn't a choice of obeying or disobeying. And so that, you know, that's the one silver lining of tyranny, is that the choices are suddenly stark. And, you know, it's a hard thing to say to anyone, you know, particularly people of color, who of course are far more exposed when they disobey, and far more likely to be prosecuted, and far more likely to be beaten up, and far more likely to be killed. But, you know, and that is a hard thing, and yet we cannot survive without it. Survival depends on disobedience, and every generation has known that. Every generation has seen that lesson, and all the people we revere today, you know, whether it was the democracy campaigners in 19th century Europe, or the suffragettes, or the decolonization campaigners, or the civil rights campaigners, and everyone says, yes, weren't they splendid people? Absolutely brilliant. Of course I would have been part of that. Of course I would have been in the resistance. Of course, you know, they're all people who were shunned and reviled in their lifetime. I mean, Martin Luther King was shunned. He was absolutely reviled. He was like public enemy #1 during his lifetime. And now he's like national hero to almost everyone except the white supremacists, you know, and everyone says, yes, Martin Luther King. I mean, after the war, everyone in France became a member of the resistance. After the war, you know, you say, oh, what did you do in the war? I was in the resistance. And a friend of mine was in a small town in France, and he pointed out to the local barman. He said, it's funny, every town I go to has a place de la resistance in the middle of town, but I haven't seen a single place de la collaborateur. Because you know, and yet, you know, the great majority of people collaborated. Very few people actually resisted. The resistance were the heroes, and the collaborators were the villains, right? But you know, that's where we are today. You know, it's the resistance who will be seen as the heroes. But, you know, to be a member of the resistance, you have to expose yourself to great threat and great risk.
George, I'm sure you get this one a lot. You know, we talk about like what we need to do in order to stop the climate crisis, and you've said it a million times. We need to stop extracting fossil fuels. What would you say to someone who is skeptic about this and who just doesn't believe that's even possible in today's society?
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, yes, I mean, this is the constant thing, that people find it almost impossible to imagine things done differently. And political failure is at heart a failure of imagination. You know, when we fail to change a system, the first part of that failure is that we've failed to see what else it could be. We've failed to see the different system that we could have. And so our challenge, first of all, is to picture that different world. And luckily, that's now made a lot easier for us, because there's loads of work showing how, with other technologies, you can get rid of almost all fossil fuel use. You know, there might be a tiny bit of residual use for purposes which can't easily be replicated, but the great majority of it's now relatively easy. You know, it's actually, you know, the switch to electricity from low carbon sources is really simple, and the switch from internal combustion engines and gas burners and things to electricity is also relatively easy, you know, or indeed to fuel cells. I mean, there's lots of ways of doing most things. Aviation, not. And aviation is one thing you're just going to have to cut down. I mean, obviously we need to cut everything down massively, but aviation more than anything else. Meat production the same, but then, you know, there are some really great substitutes being developed very rapidly indeed. And so it's, you know, we need to sketch out that better world to ourselves, for ourselves, and then we need to go ahead and implement it. And constantly we're told it's impossible. You know, you hear it's impossible more than anything else almost. But then you look at all the things which were meant to be impossible, you know, including a lot of bad ones, like the rise of Donald Trump. You know, that was just impossible. It was so impossible, you know, that 17 years before, The Simpsons made a spoof episode where Donald Trump became president because it was the most ridiculous thing they could think of. Brexit in the United Kingdom, leaving the European Union, impossible. It was just this utterly fringe, stupid idea which some lunatics had come up with, and everyone just laughed it out.
Hubert Reeves is a Canadian astrophysicist. He's now age 89. And he said, man is the most insane species. He worships an invisible God and destroys a visible nature, unaware that this nature he's destroying is this God he is worshiping. And Thich Nhat Hanh, who passed 3 weeks ago, was once asked, what's the most important thing we can do for the sake of life on Earth? So they were expecting his reply to be something like work within the system or meditate or climb over the barricades, but he did not go strategic at all. Instead, he replied, what we most need to do is to hear within ourselves the sounds of the earth crying. Now, to me, this is all about our consciousness, changing our minds, the depth of our feeling, the need for direct experience, and not just intellectually appreciating the beauty of nature. Oh, isn't that a lovely sunset? But recognizing, really feeling our own suffering and that of all life as climate systems break down and ecosystems collapse. Would you care to comment on these statements?
Well, they're both beautiful quotes, very profound and necessary. And it's this lack of honor, this lack of respect that we show towards the living world. I mean, towards each other as part of the living world, but towards other species and ecosystems as well. And everything we discover about ecosystems shows us that they are even more wonderful than we thought the moment before we discovered them. And the complexity and the interconnectedness, the relationships between different species, between different aspects, different processes of the ecosystem, different functions. Every discovery we make just says, oh, this is even more bizarre and complex and interesting and beautiful than we thought it was before. And some of these discoveries, I mean, they challenge everything we thought to be true. I mean, starting with humanity's position at the center of the universe and, you know, our innate superiority above all other organisms and stuff like this, but even just concepts like, you know, this monopoly on intelligence, you know, and that we're intelligent, and there's a few things which are a bit like us, which are intelligent, like chimpanzees and dolphins and stuff, maybe parrots, we'll allow them to be intelligent, crows perhaps, because we recognize their form of intelligence. It looks like our form of intelligence. But now we're beginning to say, hang on a moment, what if there are completely different forms of intelligence which operate in completely different ways? There's one line of speculation that the fungal mycelium is an intelligent network. There's some very interesting evidence to suggest this. In fact, it it fires its synapses, or the junctions between the hyphae within the mycelium, fire at 4 action potentials per second. It's the same as our neurons. And there's this tremendous complexity within a hyphal network, within a mycelium, which can operate in ways which are blowing our minds. You know, the more we discover about it, the more we think, hang on a moment, how could that possibly work? Plants. We look at plants and we discover that they speak. Plants have a chemical language which is incredibly precise and refined, and they talk not so much among each other, but to the completely different organisms with which they interact, particularly bacteria. And it turns out that the plant-bacterial relationship is the relationship on which we all depend. You know, we'd all have starved to death long ago if it were not for this relationship. And that the plants activate the bacteria they want to talk to, and they have this incredibly finely meshed system of communication with those bacteria in ways which are so precise that it's hard to get your head around them. I mean, they will release chemicals which will wake up a specific genotype within a species of bacterium, but not other genotypes within the same species. And this is what we know so far, is that they're producing this vast array of chemicals in order to talk to specific bacterial species and genotypes. But what we're almost certain to discover next is that they'll use some of those chemicals to modify the communication from other chemicals. In other words, they're using grammar. Now, when a species uses grammar, that's a fairly sure sign that we're looking at an intelligent life form. Are plants intelligent? Maybe they are. Maybe these are intelligent life forms. We just haven't been intelligent enough to see it. But it's a completely different kind of intelligence to ours. And so we just don't recognize it as such. And this wonder of nature, this extraordinary thing that we were born into, and not just born into, but we evolved in its midst, and we evolved to be in it, we dismiss with a flick of the hand. I mean, to go back to Bezos and Musk, which I'm afraid we have to, much as I would like to ignore them, we can just move to another planet thing. I mean, this is a planet on which we evolved. We evolved to live on a planet with radiation screening, with 1 atmosphere of pressure, with 1 G of gravity. Right? We can't live anywhere else. It doesn't work. We can only live within a very narrow set of environmental circumstances. If you just step a little, oxygen, yeah, I forgot to mention oxygen, that's also quite important. If you step just a tiny, sorry, I'm blinking phone, sorry. If you step just a fraction either side of those environmental circumstances, you're toast, you're dead. And this, the way in which we can just blithely dismiss this world of wonders, which is also ourselves. This is a sort of self-destruction. It's a self-abnegation as well as a destruction of everything that surrounds us.
How do we actively disobey? And how do we resign from capitalism as well? How can we even begin to dismantle an economic system that is so entrenched in our society and in our consciousness?
Thank you, Molly. And to paraphrase David Graeber, you know, we created this system. We can do it differently. You know, it was human beings who made this, and in terms of the span of, you know, the time that human beings have been on this earth, it's a very recent system. You know, you can date it back to the 1450s. It's really not much time at all in the wider scheme of things. It seems like less time the older you get, but probably seems like a much longer time to Sarah than it does to me. But it's, you know, it's not something which is cast in stone. You know, it's not a geological fact, but it's always presented to us as if it were a geological fact, because they don't want us to change it. They want to stifle the moral imagination. That's the whole point. The whole point of this system of propaganda under which we live is to stifle the moral imagination. And so we have to unstifle it. We have to release it. We have to break it out of the box. And we have to imagine that world in which we want to live, and imagine the economic system in which we want to live. And again, there's some brilliant alternative economists beginning to do this. My friend Kate Rayworth with Donut Economics is an excellent example of it. The phrase I use to describe the system in which I would like to live is private sufficiency, public luxury. So, I'm not saying that everything should be in the public sphere. And by public, I don't just mean state, community, all the rest of it. But some things should be ours. We should have our own modest living space and our own modest stuff within that living space, the things that we need. But if we want luxury, we pursue that in the public domain, because the world can't afford for everyone to have private luxury. There's just not enough physical space, let alone ecological space. I mean, if everyone in my hometown, Oxford, had their own swimming pool and their own tennis court and their own library and their own playground for their kids and their own art collection, Oxford would cover half of England. England would cover most of Europe. Where would everyone else live? I mean, there's literally not enough space. And again, one of the false promises of capitalism is we're all temporarily embarrassed millionaires. One day it will be all of us. We can all get it, but we can't. I mean, apart from the fact that it's an exploitative system, and that the people at the top are at the top because they're exploiting everyone else, and because everybody else isn't at the top, they're being used by the people at the top. You can't all be winners in this system. It's not set up for us all to be winners. It's set up very specifically for the majority to be losers, so that there's just not enough ecological space. You can't all have a private jet. You can't all have a yacht. The only reason that some people can have private jets and yachts is that everybody doesn't. Everybody else doesn't. Because if everybody else did, we would burn through the planet in days. There would be nothing left for anyone. But we can all have public luxury. There's no reason at all why you can't have magnificent public parks and public swimming pools and public tennis courts and public playgrounds and public art galleries and public libraries and public health systems and public transport systems. And you can have all that without taking away space from people. You're creating space for people. You're giving space to people. And you can, by sharing resources like that, you impose a far lower ecological load.
George, with overpopulation being a core cause of environmental destruction, ecosystem collapse, species extinction, and climate breakdown, why does it appear to be taboo to discuss overpopulation or control with environmental groups, in your opinion?
Thank you. So just about every talk I give, there's somebody saying, why aren't we talking about population? Why does nobody talk about population? In fact, sometimes there's 100 people saying, why is nobody talking about population? You think it sounds like quite a lot of people talking about population to me, while all saying that nobody's talking about population. So the first thing to say about it is what you've just said, Art, that generally in the few parts of the world where population is still rising fast, that's amongst the very poorest people of all. And their environmental footprints tend to be extremely small. There was a study by David Satterthwaite in India who showed that the only parts of the population which were still rising significantly tended to be the very poorest of the poor, many of whom had negative carbon footprints because they were recyclers. They were street recyclers. They were picking up materials and putting them back into the system. And so there is a real danger here of very prosperous people with enormous ecological footprints and enormous carbon footprints pointing to the poor and saying it's their fault. And there's a real temptation to transfer blame in this way. And we have to be extremely wary of that. That doesn't mean we say population growth has no impact, because clearly on some issues, in some places, there is an impact. In West Africa, for example, with the movement into forest ecosystems, that's clearly driven in part by population growth. But that's not a golden rule. It's not hard and fast. So there's a fascinating study from Tigray and northern Amhara in Ethiopia, showing that in the period since 1896, when the population of Ethiopia has risen from 7 million to 114 million, Tigray and northern Amhara, where there's been massive population rise, have become greener, have become more diverse, have become more productive, there's less soil erosion, people are better fed than they were at the beginning of that process. It's an extraordinary thing. So what's happened? What's happened is, first of all, land reform, that at the beginning of that period in 1896, the land was wrapped up by a few big feudal lords who grabbed all the best land for themselves, pushed everyone else up the mountainside where their goats and cattle had to destroy all the vegetation. Land reform allowed a much more equitable distribution of resources, and equality tends towards much better ecological outcomes than inequality does. We see a very clear example of that there. But then there was a massive land restoration program instituted from the 1970s onwards by the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, who subsequently became the government of Ethiopia. And it involved these huge efforts to replant trees, to put in bunds, to put in earthworks, to fill in erosion gullies and the rest of it. And here's the thing, where population was highest, the land is greenest. And the reason for that is that it was all based on human labor. And so there are these communal work days where everyone goes out and they've shifted literally millions of tons of rock and soil to restore this completely denuded and trashed landscape. And it has been a direct relationship between growing human population and environmental quality, a positive relationship. Now, again, I'm not saying that's universal, but I'm saying, we have to be very careful in making universal statements about what population does. Try to get a full picture of this. Is that almost all the world now has gone through demographic transition. And what we're seeing is the residual growth, which is the result of the big bulge of growth which took place 4 generations ago. And so campaigning against population growth is literally arguing with a mathematical function. It is standing on the shore. It's like standing on the shore of Ireland, right? Or for that matter, standing on the eastern shore of the United States. And 4 generations ago, there was a massive storm in the Atlantic, and it created these huge waves. And what you're seeing is the wave coming in and breaking against the shore. That's the 4th generation, as that bulge feeds its way through the population, and the population is still growing, even though birth rates have collapsed. And that's because of the demographic momentum created 4 generations ago. So standing on that shore and saying go back turns you into King Canute. You are literally arguing with that wave, which is coming in, which is a mathematical function. So it's not just perverse in some ways. It's nonsensical. It's nonsensical to try to argue with something which has already happened, but whose aftershocks we're now seeing. And what we're seeing worldwide, almost everywhere now, is a massive drop in birth rates. But what we are seeing still in most places is increasing longevity. So if you really are a population gap, if you really think that population is the thing we should concentrate on, your focus should not be on birth rates. It should be on longevity. And what I would say is, after you, sir, after you, madam, form an orderly queue.
Wonderful. I'm reminded also of when you were talking about at the wild ecosystem or rewilding level. I want to tell people that you have a TED Talk about what happened when wolves were reintroduced into the Yellowstone ecosystem and how it changed everything and even changed the course of rivers. Thank you so much. I'm going to move over to Terry now, Terry Whitehair, who has been curating some of your questions in the chat. And unfortunately, our time is very limited. So please accept our apologies if we don't have time to get to your question. This meeting actually should have been set up for 3 hours if you could have.
No, it shouldn't.
Our next meeting, next week will be. So Terry, over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. What a great conversation. And we want to involve the participants. There's been a lot of questions. So one of the first questions came not only from Vincent, but Craig. And Vincent said, in 1989, Czechoslovakia had the Velvet Revolution, which put Václav Havel into the presidency. So he asked, do you think we can have a global general strike to collapse or force this shift from capitalism?
Well, we definitely need something on that scale. I mean, if I had the sort of magic wand to say, you know, what that something is, I would wave that magic wand, but I don't believe such a thing exists, that there is a sort of instant magic formula which says this is the way we're going to do it. But it definitely needs to be on that scale. Yeah, we do need the equivalent of a velvet revolution worldwide, because you know, this system, it is driving us towards a catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. I'm not sure people can quite grasp what we're looking at here. I mean, we're looking at the end of everything we love and value. We're looking at the collapse of our life support systems. It's the greatest challenge, the greatest crisis, the greatest predicament humanity has ever faced. And yet, if it appears on the news bulletins at all, it's way down at the bottom. You know, we're just, our media, I mean, I think the media is the heart of the problem, because it just, it misleads, it neglects, it distracts, it provides the political space in which the destructive economy can continue. It's the heart of the machine, and its inability to tell us what's happening. That's the fundamental issue that we face. There was a study of the 5 largest TV networks in the US and news networks, and which showed that in 2021 on their bulletins, there was almost as much time given across the entire year to Jeff Bezos's 11-minute flight in his giant metal phallus as there was to all climate issues across the entire year.
Shameful, shameful. Well, let's see, several people had this question. First of all, John says he agrees with you, so I hope you like that. And Penny was asking, what is the alternative to this system that might be sustainable going forward? And also, what 3 changes do you think would make the largest difference?
So the alternative has to involve a system that does not rely on perpetual economic growth, because perpetual growth on a finite planet is just bound to lead to disaster. It's as simple as that. And so I'd point people towards Jason Hickel's work, particularly his new book, Less is More, which has got some really great ideas for sort of breaking out of that growth prison. I've mentioned Kate Rayworth's work. I've mentioned this idea of private sufficiency, public luxury, as I think being fundamental to that new system. But the system we need, it doesn't really have a name yet. There isn't an ism. You can't say it's something-ism. And yeah, it's up for grabs. That's in a way the exciting thing. I mean, in a way we're sort of, you know, we're in a terrifying situation, but we're also immensely privileged, because those of us alive today, you know, we're at the most important hinge in global history, the most important time there's ever been, and it's up to us to change things, not to anyone else. It's going to be too late within a few years. People who are already dead can't do it. We have to do it. We are the ones who are alive today who have to do this. And the lovely thing, I mean, it's also a frightening thing, but the lovely thing is we don't even have a name yet for what we have to do. So we can create that name. We can make this thing. And I think we can make it as a sort of Frankenstein's monster. We can cobble together a lot of good ideas from different places. I mean, that age of the sort of grand white bloke with a beard saying, I have the answer, and me alone, I've worked it all out. That age is gone. I hope it's gone at any rate. It really needs to have gone. And we need to be bringing together the best ideas that have ever been formulated from around the world. And there's some fantastic ideas, particularly from the global south. I mean, in COP26, I saw a lot of activists from the global south coming up with their own proposals. We've got to bring these together. What we need is, maybe this is the key task for the elders, is to say, right, let's just assemble all these proposals and let's take the best of everything and let's turn that into a system, not a sort of dogmatic system like some of the ideas from old men with beards have been in the past, but a system which is constantly iterative and growing and evolving, an organic system, in other words, which sort of reflects the organic system in which we live. And a part of that, I think, I would like to see is what I call political rewilding. Art mentioned my interest in ecological rewilding, but I think there's a very similar thing that we can do at the political level. I mean, at the moment, we have this ridiculous system, which is totally centralized and totally concentrated. And you have someone forms a government and they say, well, so we now can tell you what you've voted for the next 4 years. You know, you've voted for my platform. Therefore, everything in this platform I can implement, and a whole lot of other things which just came into my head whenever I wanted, because I presume that you have consented to all this because I won the last election. Now, we don't accept the principle of presumed consent in sex. Why should we accept it in politics? We should be able to participate on a daily basis in politics. And there have been some fantastic examples of how this can be done, from Porto Alegre in Brazil with its participatory budgeting, from Madrid with its Decide Madrid program, from Reykjavik with its Better Reykjavik program. These are just the beginnings, and Taiwan with its V-Taiwan proposals, showing how we can create together the world in which we want to live. And I think that idea is sort of massive devolution of power and allowing people to come together through deliberative participatory democracy to create those systems they want, rather than being stamped on by capitalism, stamped on by centralized power, told this is what you want because we decree that you want it. And we assume and we imagine, we presume that you want it, and we presume you consent to it. We should see that as an illegitimate system and create legitimate systems ourselves through deliberative democracy.
George, you just moved me, and you probably moved all the participants. We've been talking about this as the age of community, been working with a sound democracy and how do we really bring democracy back. And we are Elders Action Network, and we are talking about this movement, like this movement of action and building and creating the world that we want. So I thank you very much. And I think this is a good segue, because we are now going to have representatives from Elders Action Network and Luchara talk about the actions and the things that we can do. And so Lloyd Hansen, who is part of our Elders for Social Justice, will introduce these people who are going to talk about our actions. Thank you, George.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone.
And we're going to have just a brief statement from the various organizations that were instrumental in bringing us together. And we'll start out with Lynn Iser, who's president of Elders Action Network.
Hi, everybody. George, thank you so much for sharing so eloquently the dark side of this capitalist system. And many of us kind of understand it and know it, and you have really shared it in a manner in which we can really muse on it longer and listen to again. So I appreciate what you've been saying today and what you bring to this, very much so. I serve as president of Elders Action Network. It's really an honor. This is an organization of passionate, dynamic, and caring people. You see many of them on the screen right now. And we're working together to build a movement of elders that are addressing just the issues we're talking about today, the social, environmental, and governance issues that are so critical to our time. I hope that you feel fired up by George's words and feel the inspiration to take action. And it's only by strategic and cooperative actions together that we can gain sufficient power to make the differences that are crucial to securing a thriving and a just world for our grandchildren, grandnieces, and nephews, for all life. So that's why we do this work, and we invite you to join us. In a moment, you'll hear from other leaders within Elders Action Network. I hope that you'll listen really carefully to hear what speaks to your own heart and spirit, so that you can take action with us, so that we can stand together, support each other, give each other courage and the will to keep going as we raise our voices and speak for the welfare of future generations, because that is our job as elders. That is what we're here for at this time of life. When we do this, we inspire other elders. So there's another reason to get out there and share your concerns and go to City Council in whatever way you can, stand up and speak up. Finally, I want to note that we're engaging in a new campaign within EAN. We're calling it Follow the Money, where we will continue this kind of conversation to learn more about how our money is being used by investment companies and banks to fund projects that we don't want. And we'll identify how we can take action and strategically put pressure on those financial institutions. Stay tuned for more information. If this is of interest to you, put a couple of dollar signs in the chat with your, followed by your email, and we'll get back to you. And now listen more for other actions that you can take.
Oh, yes, action is the operant word today. George has talked about that. And the representatives of each of these organizations will be talking about actions that they are seeing moving forward. The next person will be Shirley Frericks from Elders for Regenerative Living.
Okay, yes, Elders for Regenerative Living. You may know it as Elders for Sustainable Living. And we're now in the process of transforming into a new program called the Regenerative Elder Process. It focuses on the unique gifts of elders can bring to the personal, internal, and external transformations that Paul Hawken talks about in his book, Regeneration. Regenerative economy, circular economy is one of them. Paul has talked about all the things we need to do to basically regenerate our ways of being. And wow, I'm blown away. I've been listening to some of your work, George. I mean, it's just like, wow, you can say it in a way that really, really gets me. Yeah, got it. And I'm going to act on it. So as a regenerative elder, we must think before we buy. Invest in companies that make our choices as regenerative and positive for the good of the earth and all of life. There's a link in the chat from As You Sow, which is a corporation about the corporations that are good to invest in. It's a really interesting thing. The plastic, it's on plastics, this particular one, but they have other scorecards as well. You know, who's really working to get rid of plastic pollution and who's not. So speaking of plastics, in addition to the Elders process course, a new 6-week action course called Chat and Act will start March 10th. And the first subject will be plastics. We'll do other subjects as we go along, like food waste, a really big one that contributes to the greenhouse gases. That's really the big thing. So we'll spend an interactive hour asking questions, getting answers, sharing what we've learned, and coming to some action points, like making a vow never to buy or take another plastic bag and reuse the ones we have. So why? Because the plastic in landfills gives off methane. And I'm sure you've heard about how bad methane is for greenhouse gases. We'll come to some understanding on why circular economy is so important, which is essentially regenerative. And our Earth's resources are finite, as George said. You know. But the new R's we're going to look at are refuse, rethink, reduce, reuse, repair, refill, repurpose, and recycle in a way that material can be reprocessed. You know, so it's like I want to get rid of the recycle bin personally. But anyway, so have a look at the Elders Action homepage and drop down into events, and then go under that to find out this Chat and Act starting March 10th. And I'll put the link in the chat. Crystal may already have done that. Thank you. Look forward to having you join us.
Now I'll introduce Leslie Wharton of Elders Climate Action.
Hello, I'm here with my four-legged roommate. I am serving as chair of Elders Climate Action, and we are focused on climate activism across the board, from personal actions all the way up to federal, state, legislative actions. So today, I'm just going to tell you about one action, and then you can come to our website, eldersclimateaction.org, and see more. George mentioned earlier today that human society needs to produce less than 2 metric tons of CO2 annually to avoid catastrophic global warming. Globally, the fossil fuel industry receives government subsidies estimated to be $11 million every minute. US subsidies alone total about $20.5 billion a year. In effect, the fossil fuel industry is being propped up by our tax dollars. Ending these subsidies will be difficult because the fossil fuels are embedded in our economy and our political system. President Biden's first draft budget zeroed out billions of those subsidies, but the fossil fuel industry so far has successfully lobbied to keep them in the budget. We need to do everything we can to cut off every penny of subsidies that flows to the fossil fuel industry. And we're going to provide you in the chat, but also there'll be a letter or email coming out to everyone in a day or two with links. There's a petition prepared by Greenpeace that will go directly to President Biden, asking him to stop those subsidies, telling him we, his constituents, we want that stopped, push there. The other one is an organization, Stop the Money Pipeline, with whom we do a lot of partnership. And we also partner with Third Act, which is working on the money pipeline. But the Stop the Money Pipeline offers a variety of options, including telling your banks, Wall Street CEOs, or others to stop funding fossil fuel companies. So you'll have links that are easy to go in and you can multiply your voice out there. So thank you.
Oh, and I apologize. I skipped over John Sorensen of Elders for Sound Democracy. So John, you're on.
So we're about becoming a sound democracy. And that means being able to vote freely and fairly, and that's fundamental to a democracy. So during this past year, extremist state legislators in our country have, in 18 states, have passed bills suppressing America's right to vote. And it's blatantly clear that traditionally disenfranchised groups, including people of color, younger voters, and urban residents, are being disproportionately burdened by these restrictive voting laws. This in turn has stacked the decks against effective government action and many of the critical priorities that these groups traditionally and overwhelmingly support: social and economic justice, climate change mitigation, and progressive, uncorrupt governance. These are the very causes that we, the elders within EAN, work diligently to promote. It's critical that EAN enact a strong response to counter the intentions of the authoritarian legislation that threatens our democracy. And that, I think, is what we've been talking about this morning. We are organizing state voting rights teams and supporting committees to educate, protect, and promote large voter turnout among the marginalized groups. Teams are currently being launched in 8 key states: Arizona, Florida, Georgia, Michigan, New Hampshire, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. We're employing innovative methods to reach and support affected voting groups within those states. These initiatives are volunteer elder powered, and you are needed. You don't have to live in these states to help. Don't sit this one out. Please email sound-democracy@eldersaction.org to explore what we're doing and join us in one of our state teams and committees. We are quite serious when we say our democracy and the well-being of America's future generations are at stake. So please join us. Thank you.
Chair Barraza, I thank you so much for being a co-facilitator with Art on this, and look forward to your telling us about Scholarships AZ.
Thank you, Lloyd. Yeah, of course, I want to present an action that may not seem correlated to environmental activism, but it is, and it's regarding education. At Scholarships AZ, we provide resources and other things and advocate for inclusion in order to access higher education, regardless of one's immigration status. So our action plea is that you join us in contacting scholarship foundations that exclude us from being able to apply in their requirements. A lot of undocumented students in the United States do not receive financial aid or have to pay a different tuition. So you can see why that would make it 10 times harder to achieve a degree in this country. Myself, as an example, it took me 9 years to complete a bachelor's because I had to pay out of pocket. Wow. So that template will be attached to the following email where you can just modify it and contact those organizations and demand that they include us so that we have a fighting chance in paying for our education. With education comes knowledge, and with knowledge, we can defend our environment better. Thank you.
And our final presenter is Ken Barnes with Elders for Social Justice, and he was one of the team that helped plan today's gathering. So Ken.
Thank you very much, Boyd. Hi, folks. Elders for Social Justice is focused this year on the economics of social injustice. The mantra is follow the money. We see how the ultra-rich and powerful corporations they control, and that's George Monbiot's phrase, are driving our economy to exploit the resources of human beings and of the environment for the economic gain of a few. This self-enriching drive for profits is at the root of all social injustice and of climate breakdown. The two are really inextricably linked and must be considered as such. This year, we're looking for ways to identify and call out the corporate and government actors who are using their and our resources to perpetuate and worsen human and environmental suffering. Some of the social justice issues that our team hopes to address this year are environmental racism, investment in fossil fuels and toxic products, predatory bank and financial practices and their influence on government, gross inequality of income and wealth, and medical and pharmaceutical industries that promote ill health and disease, especially for most vulnerable people. We were inspired last October when we discovered George Monbiot's article in The Guardian, which is the theme of today's conversation, of course. Indeed, the second part of George's title, quote, "It's time to stop buying into our own destruction," unquote, is turning out to be really a roadmap for what Elders for Social Justice is planning for actions this year. One action we're encouraging today is this one. The Federal Reserve can bring an end to fossil fuel finance. We, the people, could push the Fed to build an economy that serves the vast majority of ordinary working people, a system where powerful corporations will no longer force the economy to serve their own profiteering interests. And then the end of the fossil fuel era will hopefully be here. So one action, in addition to the links that are posted in the chat, is to write to President Biden. He's going to appoint a new Fed member, and he should appoint only people who are committed to truly regulating the big banks and cutting off funding for fossil fuels and other social injustice. That should be the Fed's job, and we ask him to appoint people who are actually going to do that. As I said, the links are in the chat, and I invite you next week on February 17th is ESJ's next meeting. We'll continue the conversation that George started today. Hope you can join us. Bring your ideas. Follow the money. Thank you, George.
Ken, thank you very much, and Lloyd, thank you very much for moderating that. I'd just like to say one thing. Even though we have a mix of ages in attendance, I would not call this really an intergenerational event. Multi-generational, maybe like multi-grain bread. But it's important that those of us here decide to take the initiative to identify and co-create intergenerational actions, and that we do this together. Finally, I'd like to thank some key people that were instrumental in getting this together. First, Fiona Rowe, George's assistant, who made all this happen. And I would also like to thank my daughter, Catherine Mitchell, who's Vice President of Community Impact at the Women's Foundation for the state of Arizona, who connected me with Scholarships A to Z and with Lucero. Also, I'd like to thank our team at ESJ. That's Terry Whitehair, Ken Barnes, Lloyd Hansen, Elaine Tripp, and Penny Welch. And from Scholarships A to Z, Carolina Silva, and the Scholarships A to Z leadership team, which of course includes Lucero Barraza, our co-moderator. Finally, many thanks to Crystal Gloystein and Sue Sorensen. And I thank all of you for keeping yourself on mute. I don't think we have ever had a single problem And George, finally, I just want to say a big thank you to you. And very quickly, something comes to mind from the German poet Rilke. Quiet friend who has come so far, feel how your breathing makes more space around you. Let this darkness be a bell tower and you the bell. As you ring, what batters you becomes your strength. Move back and forth into the change. What is it like, such intensity of pain? If the drink is bitter, turn yourself into wine. So George, thank you so much. I just wonder if you have any parting words, and I want to thank everyone else for attending.
Thank you very much, Art, and Lucero, and indeed to everyone who's made this possible and who's attended it. It's been a real privilege to talk to you all. And you've been a fantastic audience. I've really enjoyed your questions and your interactions. So thank you.
And thank you. And Lucero, anything you'd like to add before we leave?
Just reiterating your feelings, Art. Thank you so much, George. We see you, we hear you, and we are very appreciative of all the work that you do. So don't ever feel like you're alone when it comes to this movement.
Yeah.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you. Thank
It's a
you.
wrap.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye, George.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Thank
Nice
you.
job, team. Very good.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George and Lucero.